Every year growing up, I couldn't wait for the Passover Seder. I loved getting ready to have our friends and family over for the first night and to hear the Passover story, acting out my favorite parts of the retelling, namely the frogs jumping everywhere. I would also wait with anticipation for the moment when I would try to beat everyone to finding the afikomen, often successful. But as much as I loved finding the afikomen, I really secretly loved the moment when we opened the door for Elijah the prophet more. Each year, when me, my siblings, and our friends went to open the front door to let Elijah in, my dad would quickly gulp down the grape juice we had poured into Elijah's cup. And each year, we giggled and insisted that we knew what had really happened to the grape juice. But my dad protested. It wasn't really him who drank the grape juice. It had to be Elijah. I always loved this silly moment with my dad, where my dad, ever the comedian, would try and trick us into believing that Elijah, the prophet, had come to our house and drank the juice. This same exchange happened at every Seder that I can remember, far into my early 20s, until my dad died when I was 24. At that first Passover Seder, only about 2 months after he died, there suddenly wasn't anybody to try and trick us that Elijah had come to our house. There was a sad, awkward moment where we had to decide who was going to drink the grape juice, if we were even going to engage in that tradition at all. In that moment, I felt the loss of my dad all over again. His absence at our Seder table brought all of my grief rushing back to the forefront. And without my dad there to play the part of Elijah the prophet, it felt like it couldn't possibly be Passover, which had always been my favorite Jewish holiday. But it is on Passover and on the other pilgrimage holidays, Sukkot, Shavuot, as well as on Yom Kippur, that we take the time to remember those who we've lost in the midst of what is supposed to be a joyous time. For many of us, Passover still is a joyous holiday filled with family and food, but it can also bring up unwanted grief. There is ancient wisdom to our tradition to have a Yizkor service during these 8 days, so that we must acknowledge that this holiday can also cause grief, as if we are mourning the loss of someone who passed in recent months, or mourning the loss of someone who has long been absent from our Seder tables. It is important and cathartic to acknowledge grief because it can show up at any moment, even during celebrations. That is the odd thing about grief. In some moments, we can push it aside and go about our lives with relative ease. But something like sitting down at the Seder table and not seeing someone's face or hearing your loved one sing Had Gadya with abandon can cause us to feel renewed grief. In my first year of rabbinical school, a colleague once described grief to me in this way. Grief is like having a white piece of paper in front of us. Some days, the paper is so close to our faces that it obscures our vision so that we can hardly think about anything else. And some days, the paper is in our peripheral vision and we hardly notice it. Some days, the paper may be somewhere in the middle, close enough to see clearly, but not all-consuming. For some of us, today and during these 8 days of Passover, it may have been a time where the paper was a little closer to our faces, where we might have been feeling the loss of our loved ones more acutely than other times. Grief is variable. Our personal experience with grief is ever shifting, and memories that are triggered by scents, sounds, smells elicit new feelings of grief. So when we have those memories, sometimes that can bring the grief all right back to us. And the Passover Seder itself is a ritual driven by scents and sounds and smells. Everyone has their own familial traditions of what food they eat, what melodies they sing, so it is no wonder that this time of year can flood us with those memories and feelings of grief. Passover is also about memory. In the traditional Haggadah we read, in each and every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as if they left Egypt. Every Haggadah, from the medieval text to the social justice themed Haggadah of my childhood, And likely every Haggadah you've ever used obligates us to remember and to think of ourselves as having personally been in Egypt. Not only is Passover about memory, but it is also about the stories that we tell about ourselves, about us as the Jewish people, and about our own families and personal lives. And as Jews, we love to tell stories, and stories help us shape our realities and can help us cope with what has happened to us. And we tell the Passover story every year. Perhaps we continue to reenact this because we need to retell this particular story to help us define our current reality. We may not be slaves escaping the land of Egypt, but we do each have our own Mitzrayim, our own narrow spaces that we contend with each day and continue to try to escape the narrowness present in our own lives. For some of us, especially during holidays like Passover, some of that narrowness might stem from our grief. Perhaps we had a complicated relationship with the person who we are mourning. Perhaps we feel uncomfortable with the fact that we continue to even feel grief. Perhaps we are unsure about what story we want to tell about our loved ones who are no longer with us. Passover is a holiday of memory in the past, but it is also a holiday of the future. At the end of the Seder, we say, L'shana haba'ah leYerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Whether we are literally asking to be in Jerusalem next year, or whether we are welcoming the Messianic age, or if we are simply hoping for better times, this line reminds us that our personal stories and our story as the Jewish people is not over. We continue to tell the Passover story each year and remember our past. And we, as individuals, have the opportunity to grow and change each year. We are never the same person at the Seder table as we were the year before. This year, grief may have been front and present at our Seder tables. Next year, it may be hovering almost out of sight. Most importantly, though, this last line of the Seder, this L'shana haba'ah leYerushalayim, inspires me to think about my dad, his absence at our Seder table, and to imagine what my future Seder table will look like. When I think about the future, what stories do I want to tell my future children about my dad and about Passover? And what memories do I want to share now and in the future? And how will those memories help me live my life? I'm still working on answering those questions this Passover as I sit with the grief kind of out of sight, lingering in the corner of my eye, but I feel comforted by the fact that each Passover brings us the chance to each retell our own story of freedom and for us to remember and tell the stories of those we loved who are no longer with us.